Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Concealed Carry Podcast. Today, this will be episode 453, and I am super excited about today's episode because we have a special guest with us whom I will bring on in just a moment. We will kick off the official audio, the recorded audio portion of the show here momentarily. You probably are noticing that this episode's coming at a little bit of a different time than usual, but that's what we had to do to make this all happen today. So, hey, Will, thanks for joining. So, let's see. Make sure you guys all check in. Let me know where you're watching or viewing from. Hello, Mark. Thanks for watching. And today's gonna be a really cool episode. I think we're gonna talk about some cool stuff with a very special person. Randy, hello. Thanks for joining. You guys are coming in quick. Hopefully some of you will appreciate this later format because many of you are not having to play hooky at work or whatever to catch the podcast. So, I am going to go ahead. I think we're going to get this party started. I don't see any reason to really wait. We'll get a few more you jumping in, I'm sure. Oh, well, Jay is watching from Tampa. I just flew back from Tampa yesterday, Jay. Enjoyed my time in Florida. That was a great time. Bobby and Will from Jackson, Missouri. All right, cool. So let's do this thing. Here we go. In 3, 2, 1. This is the Concealed Carry Podcast, episode number 453. And welcome to the Concealed Carry Podcast, part of the concealedcarry.com network. I am your host, Riley Bowman. And today we have a special guest interview. And I will bring on our special guest here momentarily. But I want to let you all know that there's some exciting things coming with the podcast here in the relatively new future. We're going to be making a few minor tweaks. Some of those are still yet to be determined, so I'm not at liberty to say exactly what they are, but just stay tuned. It's going to be an exciting time. All right. So always trying to make the podcast a little bit better. We want to, of course, still emphasize the fact that we are a podcast first and a video show second. That will not change. But anyway, today's episode, we're talking about performance when it counts with a very special guest. And I will go ahead and bring him on now. And his name is Matthew Little of Greybeard Actual. There he is.
Hey, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well. Thanks for coming on and checking out my humble contributions to Riley's show. I've been excited about this too. I first met Riley at the primary and secondary summit in Utah just recently, and we really hit it off. We had some great conversations about the nature of performance, especially as it applies to shooting, both for self-defense and competition and just shooting skill in general. And I'm looking forward to the conversation tonight. I think it's going to be good.
Yeah, man. And really appreciate you making time to do it because I know that you're on the road. You're on the road a lot, traveling, working, doing all kinds of stuff, a lot of training, doing things for STI, featuring staccato pistols from STI. So speaking of which, guys, I don't really have any other official sponsors of the podcast today, but I do want you to go check out Matt Little's website, greybeardactual.com, and also staccato 2011.com. I think did I get that right?
You did. Yeah, that's it.
And people might have a hard time spelling that. So STACCATO 2011.com. That's like your day job now, isn't it?
Yeah, it's kind of a mix. I mean, I've got my training business that I started when I retired, and then Staccato initially was sponsoring me for my training, and then they wound up bringing me on to do training for them, for law enforcement agencies. So I do training and demos of the firearms. I actually just got back today from Wisconsin. I was working with a SWAT team for 2 days up there for them. And it's a great kind of meld between working for them and my own business. They both complement each other really well. And I'm enjoying it. And they're fantastic pistols. So it's really kind of a no-brainer for me.
Yeah. I know I've been really impressed with them. Times I've put my hand on them and put some rounds through them. So really cool stuff. So Matt, you have a unique background, because we've had other people on the show that were very, they were military veterans. They'd done a lot of really amazing things in the military. We've had cops, we've had, the one that comes to mind because he's quite memorable in his experience is Tim Grammons. I'm guessing you probably know Tim.
I do.
Yeah. So we've had, guys on the law enforcement side. We've had competitive shooters on the show, but it's rare that we get somebody that's done all three of those things and all three quite extensively, because you've retired from U.S. Army Special Forces.
Yep.
You retired from being a SWAT cop, and you're a competitive shooter. So tell us a little bit about who is Greybeard Actual.
So, and there's actually a war story behind the name, which if we have time, I'll get into later. It's a pretty funny story. But so basically I joined the Army at a young age, and I wound up going Special Forces in 20th Special Forces Group, which is a reserve component unit. It's a National Guard unit. And I was also a Chicago cop for a full career. So I finished up my career with Chicago PD as the training coordinator for the SWAT team, which is a full-time SWAT team. And I wrapped up with Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion of the 20th a few years before that. And it was a really good experience because it gave me both perspectives at a level that I was fortunate enough to be exposed to. And I worked with some really amazing individuals on both sides of the house. So there were a lot of lessons learned from both sides that I could carry over to the other, and they could kind of meld back and forth. And then based on the urging of some people I knew, Frank Proctor, who was in 20th Group, he was one of our instructors at the shoot house down in Alabama. And he and I had some long conversations about how he got to be so good with a pistol. And eventually he managed to convince me, as stubborn as I am, that I should compete in USPSA. And I kind of hit it and got the bug for it and just ran with it. I'm a Master-class shooter in 2 divisions in USPSA and in 2 divisions in IDPA. I shoot locals, I shoot majors. I'm on that train too, to see how far I can go in that direction too, and see how far I can take that. But I think the combination of the 3 gives me what I have to offer as a trainer. Like, that's what kind of gives me my perspective that I think is a little bit unique. I know a lot of people that have done 1 or 2 of those to the same level, but I don't really know anybody else that's done all 3 to the same level. I'm not saying they're not out there, but I think it's a relatively unique perspective.
Yeah, I agree. I was going back to the primary and secondary training summit, just getting to meet you and get to know you a little bit and learning about that. I'm like, wow, like you're a really unique individual in that, in your background, in that level of experience. Some guys might have done, 4 years active duty or something, and then got out and maybe they then went on to a law enforcement career. And then maybe somewhere in the mix there, maybe they did some competitive shooting. But it is rare that you find somebody that has done a lot. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, you did some deployments as part of ODA units.
Yeah, no, I did.
Right. That's serious stuff there, bro. So you did that. SWAT team, all that, and a Master-class shooter. Like, I know a lot of cops that aren't even close to being Master-class shooters. You probably do too, because it takes a lot of work to even get to that level.
Yeah, no, it's a serious undertaking, and then and you know this yourself because you're quite the shooter, even if you are ranked a little lower than your skill level would actually have you at. We can explain what sandbaggers are to the audience later. But no, it's every percentage of improvement beyond a certain level takes exponentially more effort than the percentages before. Mm-hmm. So there's always that law of diminishing returns for performance, right? I mean, you get to a certain point and it takes you as much effort to go 2% further as it took you to go 10% prior. And it just keeps on getting harder and harder the higher you climb.
Yeah.
And I've always, everything I ever did, I wanted to be good at, right? and I've always kind of been a geek for performance. How do you eke out that performance level from what you're doing? How do you train for it? How do you get your mind right for it? What habits do you develop that give you kind of the maximum amount of performance on demand that you can get? And I think the on demand thing is important too. And it kind of comes back to the topic we're going to be talking about tonight, is performing well on a good day when you're warmed up and you're feeling well, and everything's all nice and comfortable and you're in a comfortable surrounding, and there's nothing really on the line. That's one thing. But cold performance on demand with no warning is something else completely. And that's something you have to kind of get your head right for before it happens. When it happens, it's too late to wrap your head around it. It's not going to work out well for you. You're not going to rise to that event without having prepared for it ahead of time. I don't believe.
Yeah. I agree. I haven't been through things like you've been through, but in my limited past law enforcement work and some of the situations I found myself in, I absolutely 100% like that mirrors my level of experience, my own experience, that when stuff starts going sideways, it happens really fast, so fast your brain doesn't really catch up to it. And I think that's where your skills have to already be at a place where things can happen. There are many things that have to happen automatically.
Yes.
Right? Because you can't be standing there trying to think like, what do I do? You don't have time to make that decision. You have to just act.
There was a term that was getting passed around on the pistol forum on the internet for a while, automaticity, which, if I have the definition right, it basically correlates to subconscious competence.
Right.
Being able to do something at the subconscious level at a high level of competence. And that is really important, I think, not just for the reason you just gave, which is completely true. When things go down, like, you're just kind of observing what you're doing and you're doing what you've been trained to do. And that's how it's going to happen. But I think it's also important because, and I'm talking about like just the actual conflict right there, right? The actual moment, the moment you pull the trigger. But there's a bigger tactical picture too. And you see it a lot in military operations where, you may have moments where you're pulling the trigger, but there's also moments where you have to solve bigger problems and be aware of larger things going on while you're still doing those skills. So if you don't have them at that subconscious level, you can't open up your awareness and your conscious mind to handle the things they need to handle. Whereas if your shooting or your CQB tactics or whatever are at that subconscious competence level of skill, now my conscious brain can think about the bigger tactical picture, where I need to go and what I need to accomplish apart from just the actual physical act of conflict itself, but the bigger picture in terms of what I need to do. And it could be as simple as, for a concealed carry person, it could be as simple as having the wherewithal consciously to realize whether there's a solid brick wall behind the threat or a crowd of kids. Whereas someone who doesn't have that subconscious competence built up, they're not going to be able to think about that. All they're going to do is tunnel vision on the firearm and the threat, because they're not at that level of skill where they can have their conscious mind solve the bigger problems. Am I making sense? Is that?
Oh yeah.
Did I articulate that right?
Yes. I'm picking up what you're laying down there, brother. Because it's inevitable we're going to talk about it today, about competitive shooting, for instance. That's particularly the most recent experience that I've had where this is true. All the things you're talking about are true. Like, you're on a competitive shooting stage, a USPSA stage, and you're looking at everything and how it's laid out. And here's the thing, even though like you can stand there and look at where all the targets are and where the barrels are and the walls and other various obstacles, a shooting area that you have to stay within, all this stuff, and like you can look at it and on the surface you're like, oh, this is pretty simple. But then you get going and you get in there in the middle of it all and you're like, wait a minute, it's not that simple. I'm lost. I don't know where I'm going. I forgot where that one target was. I thought it was here, but it's not. Now, where is that thing again? Oh, shoot, my gun's dry. Now what?
You know,
like,
to circle back around to the previous point, because I think this is a valid thing that carries over from competition to the real world, right? When you just first start competing, if you come off the rails, it's a train wreck. Like there's no recovery. Like the moment it comes off the rails, things just start compounding, right? You have that cascade of errors.
Yeah.
But you look at the top shooters and they still make mistakes. But when they make the mistake, they've got that ability, like I was talking about a minute ago, their conscious mind can handle that and fix the stage plan or whatever, modify it to make it work, while the subconscious mind goes back to the process of shooting. And that's one of the things I think you get from competition that carries over as an attribute that'll help you in the real world. And like, I'm a big fan of, you ever read like Tao of Jeet Kune Do, Bruce Lee, his stuff?
I have not actually.
It's well worth reading, but he talks about skills and attributes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a skill is something like your trigger press at speed, the ability to split fast and keep the gun running where you want it to so you don't get that second shot low left, right? Something like that, right? That's a skill. An attribute is something like opening up your awareness while your subconscious is task saturated with the process it has to work on. Letting your conscious mind do something else. Like that's an attribute you build. So you need to build not just skills, but attributes as well to be truly competent, because the physical skill alone is only part of the picture.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you're speaking to my heart, because it's been an honestly recent history, and I mean like the last, I don't know, year, of where my mind has started to just be opened to some of these attributes. See, I think for a long time, my mindset was one of, well, if I just keep getting really, really, really good at these skills, then it's, like it's going to magic, like it's just all going to work. Right. But then you get to a point where finally you're like, well, I consistently do a sub-second draw, right? I consistently can do a reload, in whatever time frame. I can, shoot this target, that target, this thing, in whatever standard. And then you go to say a match, it should be a simple match, and you're like, how come I don't perform better than I am? Because I have this high level of skill.
And that goes back to the attributes, right? And
yes.
And that, I think, is what separates, like, basically your M and GM shooters from like your A class and high B class shooters. Because if you look at the actual physical components in isolation, a good B class shooter's got to draw as fast as a GM. A good A class shooter's got to reload as fast as a GM. The transitions and splits is going to be a bit of a difference, especially at distance, right? But at the typical range for USPSA match, 7 to 10 yards, 7 to 15 yards, right? It's not going to be that different. You'll start seeing the differences with the GMs out past 15, where they can still go really fast. But what makes them different is the attributes. And going back to the whole like process of like figuring out performance on demand. So skill degrades under stress. Skill also degrades in combination. Have you ever noticed that to get your best PR on a draw, it's going to be on a drill that is just a draw in 1 or 2 shots, right? That's going to be your fastest draw. If you look at the physics of it, you wouldn't think that would be the case because it shouldn't make any difference. It's still the same physical motion, whether you're doing an El-Pres or shooting a pair from the holster, right? But what happens is the more skills you string together in combination, the more of an aggregate you have, the more each individual skill degrades. The harder it is to approach your personal best on each individual skill when you start putting them together like that. And the more you string together, the harder it is to maintain each one near your top skill level, right? So that's an attribute you have to develop as well. That's something you have to work on, not just the individual skills. It doesn't take, like, I've done this a bunch of times. I know Scott Jedlinski, our mutual friends, done this a bunch of times, where I'll get his draw down from 125 to 0.95 in a short practice session, right? In isolation. That doesn't mean that one practice session is going to give you a 0.95 draw across the board in all kinds of different situations and combinations and under stress, right? You've learned the mechanics of it, but applying it takes more than just that simple mechanical skill.
Yeah. Yeah. All of that's true. Preach it, brother. It's so true. I mean, because like, okay, to build off of what you just said there, you know, a single one-shot draw in isolation is fine, but then maybe you incorporate some movement into that draw. Well, now you've introduced another variable. Now I'm moving, and now even little things you don't even think about, like now my shirt or whatever other cover garment over my gun that I'm carrying concealed is moving with me as I'm moving. It's where it's in a different place than what I'm used to. So that, you know, adds another variable to that whole process of getting your hand to your gun and getting that gun out and still getting it done in a sub-second or whatever. So yes.
And I think that that's one of the failings we have, whether we're talking military, law enforcement, civilian carry holders, right? What is the most common way for us to train in that segment? Non-competition guys, like self-defense, tactical shooters, right? Is these relatively short drills on the flat range. They may incorporate movement, but it's almost like movement isn't even really part of the drill. If you notice what I mean, like people run around and they'll do the drill.
Mm-hmm.
But we're doing ourselves a disservice, because you can get very good at that sort of stand and deliver shooting and not have it carry over that well once you start making it more complex.
Yeah.
I discovered that the hard way when I started competing. I was very good at stand and deliver stuff because of all the shooting I'd done in SF and the fact that I was into it, and I trained on my own, and I practiced, and I dry fired and everything else. So I made master in production really fast, and I could not shoot a match well to save my life. Like it took me a while to kind of reverse engineer what I was doing and make it to where I could do more than just shoot classifiers, where I could actually do well in a match setting. Because it's harder. I mean, it's harder. I'm not saying that classifiers aren't hard. We know they're difficult, but the act of putting all these different things together throughout with movement and a wide variety of target engagements and changing gears from here to here and all of this and holding it all together and keeping it all on track is a lot more difficult than, say, an El Pres, which is a relatively complex stand and deliver stage, really, when you get right down to it. It's got the turn, it's got the reload, it's got, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it's a whole different animal when you start negotiating around obstacles and trying to shave off thousandths of a second with each step you take. It makes it much more challenging than simply standing there and shooting at a static target.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. So it's apparent to me that you were already a highly skilled shooter and fighter from your experience in the Army and with Chicago PD and SWAT team stuff. I mean, you shared a little bit of that background with Frank Proctor, getting you going in competitive shooting and kind of noting that, hey, you're pretty good. So tell us, like, what was that transition like for you? I mean, like, because this is what I see. I see a lot of times cops and others. I even remember shooting a match once with I don't remember what unit he was with, but a guy that was he was an Army veteran. I didn't really get to know him all that well, but I know that he looked like he knew his stuff, and he looked like he at the beginning of the match looked like he knew what he was doing, You know what I mean? But then I remember kind of seeing him towards the end of the match and sort of appearing to be a little bit deflated. Like, and I've seen that a number of times with different people. I've seen that with myself. So what was that like? You kind of tell us about that transition. I mean, as you started shooting competitively more.
Oh, and this was
this
was humbling. This was humbling.
Yeah.
So I had known for a while I was going to do it. You know, my friends had convinced me I needed to do it. I was going to do it. And I actually waited a couple years before I started because I know my personality and I'm an all-in kind of guy. So I had to kind of make sure that I had the resources available, you know, the time, you know, where I was at in my life at that point to really dive into it seriously before I started. So of course, me being me, I decided I'm going to start in the fall in Chicago instead of like during the actual outdoor shooting season, right? Like a smart person would do. But I didn't want to wait till the spring. I wanted to go ahead and get started then. So I looked around on the internet looking for a match I could do. And there was this old website called Will Shoot, Wisconsin, Illinois. It was run by, do you know Les Kismartoni? He's a top 20 GM in production. Now he shoots open minor from AIWB concealed and still just throat stomps everybody. He's a really good shooter. So he was the guy running that website, right? So I called up Les, who I knew of. I had friends that were mutual friends with him. And I asked about the match. They have a match there every other Wednesday, right, at this indoor range. But it's an indoor range with shoot house walls. So you can shoot out to 180 like a regular match. So it's a little different than the normal indoor match.
Yeah.
What I didn't realize when I called him was that not only was he a top 20 GM nationally, but out of about 30 people at this indoor match on a Wednesday night, they averaged about 7 GMs and about just as many Master-class shooters.
Wow.
So I walked into that never having shot a USPSA match before. So they beat me up and they took my lunch money. And as I laid there crying in the fetal position, sucking my thumb, wondering what just happened and trying to figure out what train just hit me. Yeah, no, it was humbling. It really was. It was very humbling. I knew how good like national champions were because I'd watched stuff on the internet, you know, and I had all the old Lenny McGill videos from back in the day with, you know,
oh yeah,
Barnhart and Latham and Enos and all those guys burning it down. So like I knew how good somebody at the top of the game was. What I didn't realize was how good these 30 guys at a local match were going to be. And it was a great experience. It was kind of like, so I started out as a martial artist when I was a kid, like before the Army, before anything else. And as a teenager, I would seek out the adults who were really good fighters to roll with because I wanted to get better. And you're not going to get better against people that you're better than. You're only going to get better against people that are better than you, right? Mm-hmm. So it was kind of the same mindset I had. And that's what I think enabled me to just accept the ego crush that it was and be like, well, hey, if I want to be as good as these guys, I'm just going to have to deal with it and suck up my pride and start figuring out how to make things better and how to shoot better so I can catch up to them. But I have seen a lot of guys come from professional backgrounds, guys who carry a gun professionally, who go to a match and some 16-year-old chick takes their lunch money and then they decide they're never going back because it's a game and they would have won the real thing. And I'm not saying they wouldn't because there are differences between a gunfight and a USPSA match. This is true.
Yep.
But all other things being equal, the faster and more accurately you can shoot and the more precisely you can move with a firearm and enter and exit positions, the better a gunfighter you're going to be. So even if you're a better gunfighter already than the person who beat you at the match, if you're as good as they are at shooting the match, you'll be a better gunfighter than you are now. And that's how people need to look at it instead of getting wrapped up in this ego of, you know, I carry a gun every day and I have a badge on my hip and that should make me invulnerable. And bullets don't care about what badge you wear or what tab you have in the Army or what color your beret is. Bullets don't care about any of that. They care about how good you are. That's it. And sometimes it's just random luck, but that's a whole nother topic.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, it's really sad and unfortunate. Those that do show up at their first match get a major ego check and then they're just like, yeah, I'm not cut out for this, and hang up their hat and go home, because I really feel like they're missing out on a big opportunity to level up their already existing skill sets and attributes.
And going back to the attribute thing too, like there are benefits beyond just pulling the trigger faster and more accurately, right? Mm-hmm. A USPSA stage is not CQB. It's not. CQB is drastically different in the way you move. But I discovered that the better I got at shooting matches, the better I got at CQB. Not because they were the same, but because the attributes I developed at shooting stages better made me better in CQB. A lot of it has to do, I think, I have this theory that, it's basically like processor speed on a computer, right? Like how much RAM you have on your computer. Most guys that are doing CQB for a living, the speed they're going in the shoot house is as fast as they ever go, because that's their job. That's the speed they're training for. And I think that we're doing ourselves a disservice through that, because there's no buffer built in. Remember, skill degrades under stress. So building that buffer in and learning to go faster than you would actually go in application, I believe has tangible benefits, especially mentally, because it allows you to kind of open up your awareness and be calmer about what's going on, because you're not tapping out your processor speed. You're not maxing out your abilities. And I'm a huge believer in that, because I remember when I made a concerted effort to get better at shooting matches, it wasn't long after that all of a sudden CQB looked different to me. All of a sudden I got much better at it than I'd ever been before, just because my way of looking at the world had changed. I'd become attuned to thousandths of a second and trying to maximize my efficiency in my movement. So then those same attributes got applied to CQB style movement, and everything felt so much easier than it was before. And all of a sudden my awareness opened up and I could be aware of everything going on, whereas before I might have been focused more on the particular problem I was having. Now I'm still focused on the problem, but I have enough bandwidth built up where I can see and hear everything else that's going on, what my teammates are doing. If somebody else is out of position, I'm more aware of that because I'm more comfortable at that pace, because now that pace is so much below my maximum, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes tons of sense. This is the very thing that I have finally started to understand a little better for myself through experience. I think there were some things I was doing already intuitively that I was not aware of, like, talking about this processor speed, having a buffer, being able to process things faster, opening up my awareness. I think some of that was happening automatically, but I was not really ready, or I was not really paying attention to that. And now I'm starting to pay attention to that more, and I'm seeing more. So, and I liken it to, the example I like to use is when we talk about like cameras, like video cameras, right? Like your standard video camera is like 30 frames per second, right? Something that's a little bit more cinematics, like 24 seconds per second, 24 frames per second. But when we want to start slowing things down, in a video, we need more frames per second. If we want to see more, we need more frames per second. And so that's kind of the example I use, and I've used it in some of the classes I've taught, where it's like we need to do XYZ thing, and we need to get this kind of base foundation level of skill, because that's going to allow us to then start ramping up our frame rate, that we can see things, and the more we can see, the more detail we can see, then I mean, for instance, the example when I use this the most is when we're talking about like tracking your sights, sight tracking, right? Most shooters shoot their gun, they see their sight on target, they press trigger, and the sights disappear. And then if their recoil management's even moderately decent, then they see the sights come back down. They're like, oh, there's my sights again. There's the target again. Okay, bang, let's go again. And then the sights disappear, and then they come back. Then there'll be times where they think their sights are there, They fire a shot, sights disappear, sights come back, and then they look at the target and go, that's not where I was aiming, because we're in there, they didn't actually see the fact that their sight dipped low and left, or whatever, before it jumped up. And so once we start increasing frame rate, we can see things that, and we can start tracking the sight, then we'll see ourselves. We'll self-diagnose ourselves. You're like, oh, I saw that my wrist broke in my grip right before that went bang. And that actually then is like that instant feedback to yourself of, I know what I need to do now to correct that, because I saw it happen. And you're not standing there wondering what just happened. No, I surely didn't anticipate that shot or break my wrists or whatever. You know what I mean? So
yeah,
that frame rate speed
it matters. It matters. It's a real thing. Yeah, it's huge.
It's cool, man. When you start seeing all that, it changes your world.
There's a couple things I tell guys in the classes I teach, and I stole them both from different instructors. But one is that it's not a sight picture, it's a sight movie. You should see everything the gun does. And the other one is that I want them to be tuned into the gun enough where they can watch the brass tumble out of the ejection port with each shot. They should actually see like the casing flip out, how it tumbles out of the ejection port. And if they don't have that level of awareness of the gun, they're not tuned into the gun enough yet. Like that's what you need to cultivate, is that ability to kind of be aware of every input it's giving you, both physically and visually.
So a little block of instruction I took from you at the Primary and Secondary Training Summit, that was a really awesome block, first of all. And you had us go through that drill, and you even talked about that. You used that as an example of seeing the brass being ejected out of the gun. That opened my eyes even further. Like I was like, whoa, because admittedly, I don't think I had ever, at least consciously, noticed brass ejecting out of my gun. Because I whether it was because I didn't have the ability to see that or pay attention to that, or if I didn't care to see it because not really relevant to what I'm doing. Because I mean, I was definitely to a point. I'm seeing that dot. I'm tracking that dot. I'm not having an issue with that. But that exercise of just trying to see more and more and more and more was like really eye-opening to me. It's remarkable how much you actually can see when you start training your brain to be aware at that level, to be able to see those things.
And this is not who I stole it from. I stole that from Frank Proctor, the brass thing.
Cool.
But the best example I can think of that capability, that amount of awareness, is Jared from Tier 1 Concealed, the one where he shoots a target and the brass ejects and he shoots the brass out of the air. I don't know if you've seen that or not.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have seen that video.
It's insane. But that's a perfect example of that. Like he has enough awareness of what's going on, and he's slowed down the world enough with his perception that when he shoots the target and the brass comes out, he can transition to the brass and shoot it out of the air, which is pretty damn impressive.
Oh, it's way impressive.
Yeah.
Matter
of fact, I keep telling myself I need to try that. I keep forgetting. I got to try that. See if I can do it.
Yeah. Well, I'll try it too, because I like a good challenge, and it sounds like a really great challenge. So you talked about how computer shooting started helping make CQB seem easier, that your awareness was opened up, that things that you had already done many times before now just, I mean, would you describe it as sort of like your world slowing down, or how would you describe that?
I don't want to say slowing down, because I don't think that's accurate. We hear people all the time when they get done with a really good stage say that it felt slow. And I don't think that's right, because I've had the same experience myself. And I think what they mean to say is that it was timeless. It's not so much that it's slow. It's that there's no real sensation of time passing. You're just observing. You're so in the moment that you're observing everything as it happens, with no concern about what just happened or what's about to happen afterwards. I think that's probably, I believe that'd be the most accurate way to describe that mental state, right?
Yeah.
And I think that is the state that all good performance comes from. People talk about like the flow and the zone, or martial artists with like a Zen background talk about, Mushin, like no mind, right? And I think that that's what all those different terms are describing, that like state of timelessness. And I think that if we think about fast and slow under psychological pressure, it never gives us the results we want. You hear guys talk about, how often has everybody heard, oh, slow down and get your hits? Mm-hmm. And then what happens? You slow down and do everything wrong exactly like you did before, except slower. Because you were thinking about going slower instead of thinking about doing things correctly, right?
Yep.
Or I've got to go faster. So, you go out there and you try to burn it. I'm going to burn it down. Yeah. And sure enough, you make a lot of noise in a very short amount of time, but you don't necessarily make the holes you thought you were going to make in the targets. Right. So it's kind of the same thing. I think speed should be considered solely a byproduct of kind of the technique you're using, right? What sight picture refinement I'm doing, what trigger press refinement I'm doing. The speed is just a byproduct of that. Like, it's just the amount of care you need to take determines how fast you can go. And that's your current level of skill. You can't go faster in the moment. You can develop that speed moving forward. And yeah, actually, we should talk about that too for training. There are times in training where you should go faster than you can control, because that's the only way you get faster. But that's a separate issue. I'm talking about the application, not the development, right? Mm-hmm. To apply skill, you can't force skill that you don't have. You just have to let the process dictate what the speed is, because otherwise it's not going to work out well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so true. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, I'm sure you have firsthand experience too, where I have approached stages or drills or things with well, I'm going to do this faster, or
I'm going to gas it up and burn it down.
Exactly. And it usually results in a disaster, because the training wheels fall off, and you're not ready for the training wheels to fall off. So, yeah. And really kind of what you're touching on there is the whole kind of, process versus results, mindset, because if we try to achieve a predetermined result, in other words, speed or a certain speed or time, the conscious mind, it's sort of like, sugar or candy or sweets or something that, or a drug, where it's like, ooh, I like that. I like speed, let's go fast. And sort of everything else falls by the wayside. And the focus of like the conscious mind is like, let's do this thing fast.
Well, and think about too, like how often, because you push and practice to get faster, to get to a new level of speed. And that push is fun. That push can be addictive, right?
Yep.
And then you do occasionally hook it up. So you kind of get like, well, I can do it. No, not reliably. Not under stress, you can't. That's just not how it works.
Yep. Yeah. I'm also thinking of our buddy Scott Jedlinski's, way of talking about efficiency, right? That efficiency is a product of good technique, right? And that speed then comes from the efficiency, right? When we do the technique correctly, properly, then efficiency comes, and then the speed comes as a result of that efficiency as well. How do we apply this to our concealed carry folks? I mean, and you're living the civilian life now, right? You're carrying a gun concealed. I carry a gun concealed every day. Our audience is made up of concealed carriers. I mean, how do you see this applies to their world?
So I think it applies a lot of important ways, right? Because you basically, you need to build in that buffer. You've got to build in that level of skill that is above and beyond what you're actually going to need under stress. Because performance degradation, like we said, is a very real thing. You're not going to be able to do it under stress the same way. You know what I mean? So you have to, like, we had a conversation in Utah about split speed. Remember this? And for real application, with the exception of certain outlier circumstances, which would primarily be like one-on-one surprise gunfights at very close distance, right? With the exception of that, for the real world, especially for like law enforcement and military, I don't think you'd ever try to split faster than like 0.25 for real application, because that allows you the time, human decision-making for a trained individual is about 0.2, right? So you need that built into the process so you can stop firing. If you're splitting at 0.16 and it takes you 0.2 to make the decision, there's going to be another round leaving the gun after you've decided to stop shooting. And that's not a good thing legally by any means, right? But that doesn't mean that it's not valuable to split faster than that in training, because you're building in that buffer. And if I can learn to see everything the sights do at 0.16, then I can definitely see everything the sights do at 0.25, and it's far more comfortable for me. It's easier for me than if 0.25 is as fast as I can go, because then once again, I'm maxing out my ability all the time instead of having that kind of extra leeway built in, if that makes sense.
It totally does. I remember that conversation, right? Because this is such a fascinating thing to me. I mean, so we've been talking about performance, right? Where, for instance, like with a USPSA stage, or maybe you're doing CQB training, like you're down at the shoot house and you're working through different scenarios or whatever it is. And you kind of have a sense in advance of what you're going to do, what you're getting ready to do, what you're prepared to do. But there will be some surprises along the way, right? Something pops up, you're like, oh, didn't expect that, or that didn't play out the way I thought. But you have, in some context, enough of a buffer because you're already prepared enough in other areas that you're like, okay, I got this. But for many civilian gunfights or uses of force, you things sometimes just happen out of nowhere with very little room for preparation, right? So I know like where I'm going with that level of thought, based on you were just saying about splits, for instance, is things can happen so fast that if we're not prepared to handle speed, I guess, or dynamic situation, then okay. So let me back up. I'm struggling to make sense of this or say it in a sensible way. When I had my kid outside the office here banging on the door. I'm breaking down. Sorry, folks. My concentration is out the window right now because my processor is completely overwhelmed by my kid banging on the door and screaming at me. So I just had to deal with that situation. So I got to get the processor speed back. I got to get things spooled back up here. If you're wondering why I've just totally lost my mind here. So back to what I was trying to say. Back to the split thing, right? What I see what I observe in like body cam footage from officer involved shootings, Matt, is something happens and it happens so quickly, so suddenly that it's like, oh, it's go time, and the officer reacts appropriately to that stimulus. But I think that in that instantaneous moment, that processor and the memory capacity, everything is just like boom, everything to the max. And all of a sudden, the gun comes out of the holster, gun on target, and it's just whack, 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 with very little control. And what that tells me, and then what we see too, is we see this in particularly the chest mounted body cameras is a great angle because we could see that gun just going every which way. like almost zero recoil control sometimes even, and it's kind of scary. And all I can think of in that moment watching some of that is this. It seems to me this officer's probably never fired their gun at that tempo before, right? And why? And so now, why are they doing that in that moment? Why are they shooting like that? I guess I would flip that around to you. Like, why do you think that happens sometimes?
I actually read a really good study on this. I can't remember who did it. I wish I could. I'm sure it was some FBI study. But basically, all the body cam footage of gunfights, everybody's splitting at about 0.22 to 0.25, which is as fast as they can pull the trigger because they haven't trained to pull it faster, right? So they're going to default to just yanking on the trigger as fast as they can because it's a life or death situation. But the problem is most police quals, the par times are generous enough where their splits are like anywhere from like a half-second split would be a fast string of fire on a police qual.
Yeah.
So now they're splitting twice as fast as they ever do in training, and they're not trained for it. They're not prepared for it. So
yeah.
it goes back to that buffer effect and that processor speed, right? You've got to push it faster. I'm a big fan of making things more difficult in training than the real event is going to be. And I got to clarify that a bit because there's a lot of people that say that, and what they actually mean is they're going to make it suck more in training than the real event. And those are two different things. And I'm not saying that the suck fest doesn't have value, because it does, because it builds kind of character and mindset and fighting spirit, right? And those are important attributes, but they're not skill. The suck fest doesn't build skill. That's not how you make skills better. So when I say make it more difficult in training, I mean make the shots harder, make the time limits faster. You know, if I can shoot tight partial targets at 20 yards and split fast on them, then most of the things I would have to do as a civilian carry holder are going to be far easier than that. They're going to be slower and an easier target. So if you make it harder than the event, then the event is going to be easy, you know? And that's a big part of what I think proper training should be. You have to temper it based on the personality of the trainee, though. I'm a very stubborn person, and I can just stay in the suck fest for as long as I think I need to get better. But some people will get disheartened by that. So like when you're teaching, you've got to make sure you don't beat them down too much. You know what I mean? You can't make it so hard that they don't have any hope, because not everybody has the right character for just accepting that and driving through it. So you have to kind of temper that for that. But otherwise, I think it's really valuable.
Yeah. I was thinking of Tim Herron. He describes kind of like if walking is you trying to get better with a pistol, or really any gun for that matter, like one of your foot's your speed foot, and the other foot is, I think he says, your vision foot. Because part of what, like going fast or being able to perform under pressure speed, is that a lot of times it takes our brain, and it's really our brain, I mean our vision, but our brain, to catch up to what's happening and to what we're doing. But we to learn that, to train the brain, it requires the brain to be exposed to that, so that we start picking up on the patterns of what's happening, and then the brain starts catching up and understanding what it's seeing in front of our eyes. And so we need to take those steps forward with our speed foot first, and then give our
figure it out.
The brain the chance to figure out exactly to understand what's happening. It doesn't work the other way very well at all. In fact, I don't think it works that way at all. I think you have to push yourself to that threshold. You have to push yourself through that breaking.
Oh, wait, I thought slow was smooth and smooth was fast.
Well, if Tim were listening, he'd say, "Shut up."
No, that makes me just as crazy as it makes him. I hate that.
That's
actually, like,
right. He has his shirt that says, "Slow is smooth," and then stop talking. Yeah.
One of the things I do when I teach shooting is I do this on at least one demo every class, right? I'll show them kind of my process for working on a skill in isolation. And the first rep will be like what I believe my cold on-demand performance is. Like the best I can do with 100% guarantees cold, right? Like your first stage at a match or like a gunfight, because the gunfight's always cold on demand.
Yeah.
For civilians anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll start pushing either, the speed or the difficulty or, some aspect of it until I find a failure point. And I'll intentionally fail in front of the students when I do it. Like I'll push it until I fail. And then I look at them and I say, here's the thing. When you do this in training, you want to find your failure point, and you don't want to go past that yet because that's your failure point, but stay there for a bit. Do some reps right there and try to fix it. Don't go slower. Don't slow down and get your hits. Don't back off the volume at all. Find that point where it just starts to fail. Not a catastrophic failure, but just, it just starts to fail. And then stay there for the remainder of your time on the drill and try to figure it out. And then something else I think is really important, both for law enforcement, military, and for, self-defense shooters, is at least the last drill of the day, you can't end on that push. At least the last drill of the day, you've got to end with another cold on performance or on-demand performance pace, because that kind of resets your brain so that when you leave, you're in that mode as opposed to pushing, right? Because you don't want to leave the range and have pushed for 2 hours and then get in a gunfight and just spray bullets because you're stuck on pushing for speed. You've got to bring it back in. You got to dial it back down and finish at a point where you could do it consistently on demand and kind of rewire yourself for that so you don't leave on the wrong mental state.
Yeah. I mean, you're kind of touching on like what Steve Anderson describes as speed mode versus match mode, or Scott Jedlinski talks about speed mode and real mode, right?
Yep.
And by the way, speed mode is a great thing to practice in dry fire. As far as working on some of those manipulations and that kind of stuff, like pushing yourself to and even beyond failure to sometimes just to see what you can do speed-wise with a gun in your hand. But doing speed mode on range live fire is important as well. Like we've been talking about, getting the brain sort of exposed to and inoculated, if you will, against those things, against that level of speed. And then it starts, it takes some time sometimes, but it starts picking up. I appreciated that as well about your instruction in that block that I took from you, as you talked about that very thing. You're like, now push it to where things start breaking down, and stay with it and see if you can start figuring it out. And that was kind of eye-opening for me, as far as, because normally the tendency is, well, that's not going good, I'm going to stop now, let's reset, as opposed to, this isn't really going well. I'm throwing bullets all over the place, left, right, up, down, but let's see if maybe changing a little something in my grip, maybe increasing pressure a little bit, whatever it is, let's see if I can get it back. And it was a really cool drill. Maybe not ammo friendly for the current times, but it was a great drill.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think my classes are ammo friendly for the current times.
Yeah.
I'm going to try to get better about it if things don't get better for people soon.
Yeah,
because I know ammo is really tight for everybody.
Right.
But there's some of these drills, there's so much value. There's so much to be learned from them, and I think this goes back to another thing I think people do themselves a disservice by. Tactical shooters. We'll use that as a phrase to encapsulate, CCW, military, law enforcement, all of that, right? We get taught a way to do something and we become wedded to that technique and we're afraid to experiment. And do you watch UFC at all? Watch MMA fighters?
Yeah, here and there. Okay. So, not like following every fight, right, but I do enjoy it when I can.
So we'll use this as an analogy, right? Your top fighters, none of their technique looks exactly the same, but they all follow the same principles, right? And to come back to shooting, I mean, out of the top guys, does any two top shooters have a grip that looks visually identical? No. Not really, right? I mean, think about everything from Bob Vogel with the extreme cant over to to Ben with the thumbs up, to, everybody's a little bit different, right?
Mm-hmm.
The principles behind the grips are the same, but everybody's hands are different. Everybody's body structure is different. Everybody's psychology is different. So you manifest the principles differently to make them ideal for you. And I think that we're afraid to experiment in our training. And part of it, I think, is that, we feel like we learned a way to do it and we're imitating how that way looked without understanding what actually makes it work. And part of it, I think, is just that we're afraid to go down a dead end, right? You don't want to waste training time wandering off down this dead end and not figuring it out. And I understand that, but I don't think proper experimentation will do that. I think proper experimentation will help you avoid those dead ends instead and give you the ability to kind of work your way around the stalling points and figure out how to develop your training and your technique so you can maximize your rate of improvement.
Yeah. That's deep stuff, man. I'm gonna bring this back around to, in fact, we had a comment here from Lance. He says he just got his permit to carry concealed last month in North Dakota. He's excited to start learning more and getting more practice in. He says this conversation is almost completely over my head, yet I still enjoy listening to it. I think what I would try to say to Lance, someone like Lance, is, there's something that caused you to go get a concealed carry permit. And for most people, because I interact with a lot of people, I've certainly have taught classes, and this is a common thing I hear, is something in their world has happened or changed or prompted them to realize that they are their own first responder, and they are now pursuing a permit, and they're going to carry a gun. And there's a lot there. I mean, there's so much that entails, from mindset to, your dress, how you're carrying the gun, to actually being able to use the gun and use the gun under pressure, and being good and wise in your decision making. Decision making is such a underappreciated skill of its own when we're talking about the use of force against somebody. You're fine. Go ahead.
The ability to spot like pre-attack cues, the ability to just kind of make tactical thinking part of your daily life. So not so that you're paranoid. I'm not saying you should be paranoid, but just where you stand, where you sit, where you walk. When you're in an urban environment, do you walk close around a corner where somebody could surprise you, or do you walk wide around a corner where you're kind of pieing it off as you go? Little things like that. When you stand in a public place, what is your back to? What are you looking at? When you sit in a public location, how are you sitting? There's the old cliche of the back to the door, but there's some truth to that sort of thing. If you set yourself up properly, you can avoid a lot of trouble before it starts. And one thing I think that is just about universal among all mentally balanced people that have experienced a lot of violence. Notice I had to clarify that, right? But anybody who's experienced a lot of violence, especially people who have had violence be part of their profession, if they have half a brain, they understand that it's a very serious thing and it's not to be taken lightly. And there's so much random chance that you don't want to be in a fight. If you've been in enough fights, you don't want to be in a fight anymore unless you absolutely have to. And the ability to avoid it before it happens is crucial for everyone, especially for civilians. Because it's just not, if you can avoid it, because it's just not worth the headache if you could have avoided it. And I'm not saying you always can either by any means, but yeah, I think awareness is more important than pulling triggers for sure.
Yeah, I agree on that for sure. But getting back to a lot of what has dominated our topic of discussion tonight, which has been more on the shooting side of things, level, of shooting performance and so forth, that we want the shooting aspect of the equation to be, I want that to be the easy part of dealing with this threat. whatever that threat might be. It should be the thing I least am concerned about in the moment, right? But the problem is a lot of, like, I know people I train, people you train, that there's a lot of people carrying guns professionally and unprofessionally, non-professionally, that need to step up their game with that pistol in their hand. It's hard. It takes work. It takes time and effort, but it can be done.
Pistol shooting is a very challenging thing. It's much more difficult than other firearms, for sure. And I think people underestimate how good enough is, And I'm not saying you don't need to be a master-class shooter to be good enough to be able to handle yourself. I mean, most of the guys in SMUs are probably high C, low B class shooters. When you look at like USPSA standards, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's probably plenty good enough.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that's a lot better than most people realize it is.
Yes.
And it takes a lot more work than most people realize it takes. Like, it takes work to get that good. Forget GM and M. It takes work to get to B. It takes a lot of work. If you're a B class shooter, you're no slouch. And I think a lot of people who carry a gun either for a living or to protect themselves have I don't want to say a false notion. I don't want to criticize people. That's not the point of what I'm saying. I think they haven't been exposed to what good actually is, and they haven't been given the data to make an informed judgment about what they need to do a needs analysis for their skill. They don't have the data. Nobody's given them the data for them to understand how good they need to be. So it's not a dig on them, but if you're going to carry a gun every day, you should probably put enough work in it to be pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's your job, especially like guys on law enforcement or military teams where their jobs involve like hostage rescue or other high stakes things, there is no good enough. Like, you could work the rest of your life and you should never be satisfied. Yeah. I think.
Yep. Well, yeah, I personally feel like nobody should be truly satisfied with where they currently are, right? Because you never know when that fight's coming. And like you said, Murphy always gets a vote, right? Like, things can happen, things can break. Luck may not swing your way. So I want to make sure I'm constantly advancing my own abilities and skills to be the best that I can be, because I never know when that day is going to come that I need to use my gun or any other tool.
And to get philosophical again, right? I mean, there really is a lot of value, I think, to the pursuit of excellence for its own sake. So if you're pursuing excellence in something that your life may depend on, and that's why you picked it, that's fine. But for a lot of people, I think you'll come to find that the actual pursuit of excellence itself becomes the point. Kind of walking that journey is in and of itself a very rewarding thing and brings benefits. There's a reason why people go to martial arts to build character, right? And shooting is a martial art. Like, that pursuit of excellence, that ability to take your ego out of the equation and really, really work on every little piece you can to get the last little percentage of performance you can find. That journey alone has huge dividends, I think, for your character and your development as a human being, regardless of self-defense. So if you're doing it you can do it with anything. You can do it with calligraphy or painting or soccer. But the fact that you're doing it with a skill that also could save your life or your loved ones' lives makes it all the more valuable. And one of the reasons I think why martial endeavors have always been prized highly for their character development is because of the stakes, right? You can take another pursuit, another path, and use it to follow excellence and seek out excellence the same way, but the stakes aren't there. Whereas with something martial, the stakes are literally life and death. And that puts like a seriousness to it that helps you develop those attributes that can carry over to the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You see that, I think, in shooters' approaches to how they practice or how they shoot. Like, there was a time in my life when I would go to the range. I mean, I was young, but I would go just to have fun, right?
Yeah.
Just to blow some ammo and make some smoke and noise, because it was and it is fun. But now I never go to the range just to have fun.
No.
The fun
There's
is
always a
in
plan.
the fun is in the excellence, in finding
Yep.
or discovering the excellence. That's the fun.
Back to Steve Anderson.
Right.
Remember famous Steve Anderson quote when somebody told him dry fire was boring, and he responded, "Yeah, you know what's not boring? Winning. Winning's not boring."
Right. Yeah. That's yeah. So if someone were to say, "Hey, Riley, let's go to the range and just do a bunch of mag dumps," I'd be like, "Yeah, like."
Nah.
Really, what I might end up doing if somebody was providing the ammo, I'd say, "Okay, let's do that." While I'm going to be doing those mag dumps, I'm going to be really watching and paying attention to my dot or my sights and trying to continually learn how to process those things better, faster, what kind of inputs I'm putting into the gun. But I'm not doing it just for the sake of burning the ammo. That's for sure.
I'm a big believer that if you're serious, if you're training, I mean, there's a difference between training and having fun and plinking. And training is fun, especially if you have the right attitude about it, right? Like you said, that pursuit of excellence is the part that's fun. But when you're training, every bullet should be a lesson learned. Like if you don't learn something from that bullet, you wasted that moment and it's not going to come back. You wasted that round. It's done. It's gone. Every time you fire the gun, you should be figuring something out, learning something, even if it's minuscule, some little bit of a learning point from it. Otherwise, it's not productive.
Yeah. Agreed. Lance here, who's viewing on Facebook, has a question. His first question is actually, I'm pretty sure, in jest. He says, "Where do we get cheap ammo for the range?" But then he asks, "Are dry fire apps for target shooting at home worth the money?" I would switch that up a little bit and ask what you think. Like, what would be some advice or tips that you would have for particularly a newer concealed carrier? That's the context for them. What dry fire tips would you have?
First, they need to realize, because a lot of people misunderstand what dry fire is. I mean, not from the competitive world. Like people in general, they think of dry fire as just the trigger presses, right? Or maybe trigger presses, draws, and reloads, physical manipulations. I would say if I could go back in time to when I first started seriously dry firing, when I started competing, I dry fired before that, but I mean, seriously, every day, putting in the work every day, right? If I could go back in time to that younger version of me to prevent wasted time, I would say focus on being honest with what your sights are doing from the very beginning. Don't cheat yourself trying to beat the timer and be sloppy on the movement in the sights and go, "Oh, it would have been okay," and it really wouldn't be okay. And I know it's harder for the beginning shooter. You need to push the speed. You need to push the speed to the point where you make mistakes. You've got to make mistakes or you're never going to get better. But cultivate that ability to really see what the sights are telling you in dry fire, because that's what pays huge dividends from dry fire. If you don't cultivate that, then all you're doing is building the physical manipulation. You're not building your marksmanship in dry fire itself. Mm-hmm. The other thing I would say is don't worry about gimmicks. There's a million things out there, and I'm not saying they don't have value. They do. I had a lot of value from, I know you're a big fan of the SIRT pistol. I had a lot of value from the SIRT pistol earlier on in my personal training. There's a lot of value to a lot of those things, but people, they want to find something that makes dry fire live fire. And that's not what dry fire is. Dry fire can be a phenomenal tool for developing your shooting, but you're never going to make it live fire. The recoil control part still has to be learned on the range. And the confirmation that you're seeing the sights correctly and pulling the trigger correctly still has to happen on the range. Nothing you buy in dry fire is going to change that. And a lot of those things, early on, a lot of them can have value, but I think eventually everybody winds up just using the gun they shoot and miniature targets, and being honest with what the sights do. And that's all you really need eventually. I'm not saying don't play around, play around with the Mantis X, use a SIRT pistol. If you want the targets that fall down when the laser hits it, play around with that. There's value to those things, but none of them are really essential. What's essential is learning to see your sights and pull the trigger and index the gun and do manipulations fast.
I concur. I wish I had understood that very thing as well in my earlier days of dry firing. Because like many others, I thought, well, dry fire is challenging because like I'm supposed to be doing trigger presses, but I have to reset my gun, and that's not realistic and stuff. But there's so much more to it than that. Even with a Glock, I know that, like, I use that as an example because it's a striker fired gun that once you press the trigger, that trigger stays back. I can get very valuable dry fire practice with a Glock in my hands where I am even doing target transitions and I'm watching the sights land on each target as I'm essentially smashing the trigger because I'm going fast and I'm looking to see what, yes, we're wondering, well, the trigger's already back. I'm smashing back into that trigger, right? I'm simply making the movement with my finger and I'm watching what's happening as I do that through the sights. And that tells you so much about your grip, how effective it is, how, and also how good your trigger press is, or if you're getting other things happening in your grip and in your wrist as you're smashing that trigger. I say smash because that's when I'm going fast, that's what I'm doing.
Oh yeah.
Guys will probably that are viewing or listening are like, what do you mean smash the trigger? Well, that's kind of what you got to do when you're going fast.
Yeah. If you want splits like under 2, there's no longer a precision trigger press going on.
Right.
No, it's just, and I think you make an excellent point that kind of expands. I think rather than just saying be honest with your sights, because what you're doing right there is you're being honest with your trigger pull, even though the trigger is dead. And when I still shot Glocks, that's the exact same way I did it. I didn't put, the business card in the breech or any of that. The first trigger pull was a real trigger pull. And after that, I just tried to replicate the exact amount of force I would use on the trigger, on the dead trigger. And I think that is perfectly fine. I don't think there's any issue with that whatsoever. And now that I'm shooting the 2011s, I get movement in the trigger, but the hammer's already fallen after the first trigger pull. So it's not exactly the same, but as long as I'm pulling the trigger the same way, that's all that matters.
Yep. I do it the same way. Couple last things. I told you I was going to ask you this and thought we'd talk about it earlier, but here we are more towards the end. When did you first carry a gun concealed?
Legally?
Yes.
So when I first got off active duty in the Army, I was a cop in suburban New Orleans, actually. That's where I first started out my law enforcement career. I wasn't there that long. I was in the suburbs and then in the city, and then I went back into the Army for the pipeline for Special Forces. So that was my first experience with truly carrying concealed every day, all the time, right? And I did basically everything wrong, pretty much. I can't think of a single thing that was right. I remember I had this Uncle Mike's holster that, would close up when you pulled the gun out of it and had the big flat black metal clip on it. And I think I must have spent at least 2 or 3 weeks trying to carry it in the small of my back before I realized that was like the least practical place to ever carry a gun. I think it actually fell out a couple times. That's why I quit. That's why I decided that wasn't a good idea. No, it was a mess. I didn't really have proper instruction on it at the time. Not a bit.
Yeah. Hey, you and I were sort of reminiscing before we even went live today that I had a very similar experience. And yes, I have had a gun fall out of a holster, a very similar holster. And it was a scary moment, to say the least. Yeah. I mean, it's like, oh, snap. And that's when you realize for the first time ever, because you don't know what you don't know, that not all holsters are created equal. And yes, retention is an important thing.
Yes. And then after that, for years, it was the leather pancake holster on the strong side hip, underneath the shirt and underneath the jacket. And that was the way we did it for forever, for a long time, before Kydex, before appendix came back into fashion, before all that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What was one of the more difficult lessons for you to learn in concealed carry, like how to actually carry a gun concealed successfully?
I don't know if it was a difficult lesson, but I think it's probably the primary lesson I would recommend that other people sort out as soon as they can, right? I mean, obviously you need a quality holster that is comfortable and will hold your weapon securely, right? And then you got to figure out where you're going to carry and how you're going to carry. And it's not as simple as just, I'm going to carry appendix. There's nuances to it based, it's like we talked about grip, where everything's slightly different. The placement of my holster is going to be different than Scott's. The placement of your holster is going to be different than Tim Herron's, because our bodies are different. Our physiology is different. So you've got to figure those things out. And the best way to do it is to take your gear to the range before you carry it and sort that stuff out. And do some things that are athletic and see if the gun is retained right. Do some things that involve movement and see if it's safe. Do them with a dry gun. Do some live fire exercises and, practice clearing your cover garments and reholstering safely. That's a huge one. That's something you should do in dry fire a bunch as a new concealed carry guy, is reholstering. Because where does everybody shoot themselves? On the reholster. It's when they put it back. And a lot of guys have done that in the real world too. They pull a gun for a real thing and then they wind up shooting themselves in the leg on the reholster. And if you train properly, that should never happen.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Very good stuff. You carry a gun these days, I'm sure. I'm guessing you're carrying a staccato.
I am. And, weather and cover garments permitting, I actually carry the full size. I carry the XC, which is a 5-inch gun. Yeah. But I'm used to that. I carried a 5-inch Glock for work appendix for a long time when I was off duty. And I carried my work gun off duty too. If I'm just running to the store or if it's really hot out, I'll carry the little, compact single stack one. But I tend not to, just because comfort should be part of your decision for how you carry. But I don't think comfort should necessarily dictate the gun you carry. You should address how you carry it for comfort. But I think you need to carry enough gun to prevail in the fight. And for most things, that single stack is fine, but not for everything. And I would quite honestly rather have, the 20-round capacity and the increased shootability of the XC. Not that the little gun's not a great gun, it is, but all other things being equal, the XC is going to be a better choice for a gunfight. So I try to carry that as much as possible.
Yeah. Carrying a full-size gun isn't without, and you're not saying this, but it isn't without its challenges. So what are some of the things as it relates to how, where, and maybe the holster choice that you use to carry? What are some things that you've figured out to make that work for you?
So both for 3 factors, really. I'm a big fan of the foam wedge on your AIWB holster. And it really helps you out 3 different ways. It helps concealability because it keeps it from angling out and printing as much. It helps with comfort because now the holster isn't digging into your hip the same way, because you've got that foam wedge kind of cushioning it and pushing it out a bit. And also for safety reasons, that wedge prevents you from flagging your body on the reholster. So you're not going to flag yourself the same way. I'm not saying you have to flag yourself without the wedge, but it's much easier to avoid with the wedge.
Yeah. For a long time, I didn't even know about the idea of adding a wedge to a holster. Guys will talk about cutting yoga blocks and gluing them or Velcroing them to the holster, or using like shoe inserts and things like that. There's also products that are pre-made, with that purpose in mind. even companies like Dark Star Gear and
Yep.
others putting out purpose-built gear for that for that purpose, for that idea of a wedge on a holster. It is a very, because it's about like you said, everybody's a little bit different, right? And it's about putting that. It is added bulk, right? People are like, well, that's added bulk, but it's about putting that bulk in the right place that makes it work. You know what I mean? Like, and you're not talking about adding bulk to the top of the holster where your belt and your waistline and everything is. You're talking about the lower part of the holster and maybe smoothing out or rounding out some of the edges, but also adding that extra thickness in the right places that causes the holster to ride the way you need it to point the way you need it to angle the way you need it to. And it takes some experimentation for sure.
And you've got to figure out exactly, I mean, we talk about appendix, but if you look at this too, this is somewhere where people vary pretty significantly, right? Where the gun is actually placed. Some guys are more towards the center line. Some guys are further out towards the hip. And I think a lot of that just has to do with, like I said, your body, how your body is shaped and what's going to be comfortable for you and work efficiently for the draw stroke for you safely. And I think you got to play around with all that stuff. You can experiment with all of it and figure out what's best for you. And you can get guidance from guys that have experimented before you. But like so many other things, to truly have the knowledge yourself, you've got to do it yourself. You've got to, it has to be experienced personally. Otherwise, the knowledge is just academic and you don't know how to apply it for yourself.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, we've probably taken way too much of your time, Matt, and I seriously appreciate all the wisdom you've shared with us and our listeners today.
I've had a great time. Every conversation we've had so far has been fantastic. So I was excited about the podcast because it was going to be like just another burn barrel chat at the range between you and me, like we had in Utah. So
yeah, man. Well, I look forward to hopefully additional future conversations. Maybe even back on the podcast again at some point.
I'd like that. Both on and off the podcast. I'd like that. So
sure.
Yeah, let's make it happen for sure.
Very good. Very good. It looks like I'll be working to host you for a training course in Colorado sometime next year. Details still to be determined. I still actually got a reply to your lovely wife on the email she sent me about that. But folks, just know there will be an opportunity at some point next year, if you'd like, to come and participate in a class together with me and Matt.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that a lot too. It'd be good to get on a range together again. So we need to roll another match together too. We got to shoot. We got to shoot against each other again.
Absolutely, I agree with that. Well, good. I hate to end it, but it is the way it is. You got to get on to doing important things in your world, and I got to get on to doing important things in my world. I think tonight is bath night here at the Bowman household for the kids.
Well, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it, and I had a great time, and hopefully your listeners enjoyed it too. So
absolutely, thank you, guys. One more time, you want to go check out. Look up Greybeard Actual on Instagram, Facebook. Yeah, I know he's got various social media accounts. Also, greybeardactual.com. And then again, Matt does great work with Staccato, STI, firearms, Staccato 2011-2011.com. Amazing guns. Kind of expensive, but amazing guns. So if you're into that kind of thing, go check them out. I think you'll like what you see. I see more and more of them on the firing lines all the time, including those XCs. And, oh, man, it's sorely tempting. It's a really cool gun. So, guys, we'll let you go. Matt, thank you so much, sir. We wish you all the best in your endeavors and all the important work you're doing. I mean, you're working with so many different SWAT teams and other various agencies, and what I appreciate about that is that those are the guys that, besides us being our own first responders, those are also the guys we depend upon to do really important work and keep us safe. So thank you for all the work you do, Matt.
Thank you. And thanks again for having me on. Like I said, I had a great time.
All right. So with that, we're going to let you all go. A reminder to train right, train often, and train safe so you can fight hard, fight fast, and fight true. Take care, everyone.